Hey everybody, my name is Jackson. Today we're going to do a small overview of the anatomy of the heart. We're going to do a small overview of the EKG and what it tells us. We're going to look at Wigger's diagram and take a deep dive into that. We're going to go over a case study to further some of those ideas, as well as look at the pathologies of the heart and see how this might affect exercise tolerance, and how we might treat a patient who suffered through these. All right, so up on the board, we have the anatomy of the heart and we've got an EKG. So starting with the anatomy of the heart, we have the right atria, the right ventricle, the left atria, the left ventricle, as well as our SA node and our AV node. So when the heart contracts, when we send a signal that says we want to send blood to the rest of the body by pushing it through the heart, we're going to start at the SA node. The SA node will receive the impulse and send impulses across in almost a 360 kind of way like this. This causes atrial depolarization. When this happens, it's almost like a ringing effect into the ventricles. This will eject as much blood as possible into the ventricles so that stroke volume can be increased once the ventricles contract. Now this impulse continues from the SA node down to the AV node. The AV node collects this impulse, kind of slows it down for a second in what's called AV nodal delay, then sends the impulse through the bundle branches and up the Purkinje fibers. This AV nodal delay allows for as much blood to fill the ventricles as possible, and this method of depolarization allows the ventricle to kind of wring out blood so that we can eject as much as possible. This blood then goes to the aorta and out of the rest of the body. Now for our EKG, this is just a graph that shows this electrical activity. So starting with our P wave, this is atrial depolarization. Then we have our QRS complex. This is atrial repolarization, as well as bundle branch depolarization going up, and Purkinje fiber depolarization going down. We finish with our T wave, which is ventricle repolarization. Now this gives us a great picture of what's going on in the heart electrically. However, it begs the question, what if there is some cell death in the heart? You might still see this electrical impulse and think that everything is going as it should, but if the muscle cell isn't awake to receive that impulse, then of course nothing is going to happen. If that's in the atria, we're not going to have proper filling of the ventricle. If that's in the ventricle, we're not going to have proper ejection into the rest of the body. That's why Wigger's diagram, which we'll talk about in a second, is so important for the study of cardiovascular physiology. Okay, this is our Wigger's diagram. At the bottom is what's called a phonocardiogram. This basically just shows the audible sounds that we hear when the heart contracts. You'll notice that there's a first sound and a second sound that are coupled with the aortic valve opening and closing. This sound is just when the pressure gets so heavy that the valve blows open, and then the pressure will drop off, eventually causing the valve to close. This is not all that important when looking at cardiovascular function. It does provide a slight tell as to whether or not the heart is functioning, but the rest of this is where we see what we really want to see, and that's that the heart is functioning as it should. So let's start with this kind of first section right here. We've got our EKG, we've got volume readings, we've got pressure readings of both the atria and the ventricle, and at the very top in red, we've got aortic pressure readings. So we see in this first P wave, there was a bump. And as we discussed when we were looking at the EKG and the anatomy of the heart, this is an atrial depolarization. So when this happens, you'll notice a slight increase in ventricular volume. That is because the atria is pushing as much blood as it can into the ventricle. Once it's done that, and we start to hit atrial depolarization right here, you'll see a drop off. That's because both active filling and passive filling have taken place in the ventricle, so there's kind of no more blood to fit in or give. Moving up, we have slight increases in both our atria and our ventricle. That again is because of the atrial depolarization that we see down here. Basically contracts, the space that the blood has is lessened, so that pressure will have a slight increase. Aortic pressure actually starts to decrease. This is because the blood that was once there is being sent out to the rest of the body, and this aortic valve up until this point is closed. So we're not feeding it any more blood, and again, the volume is decreasing, the area is staying the same, so that's why we have that pressure drop. Now let's move to our QRS complex. So we notice that up until this dotted line that we see, there's really nothing happening with volume. That again is because all the valves are closed, so there's nothing entering or leaving. But we do see that there is a slight increase in this atrial pressure, and there's a massive increase in that ventricle pressure. The slight increase in atrial pressure is because, as we see from this EKG, there is still a contraction in the ventricle. So we have lots of pressure building. This pressure actually pushes a little bit back on that mitral valve and causes that slight bump that we see there. Again, kind of moving off of that, from this depolarization of the ventricle, we've got huge pressure build in that ventricle pressure graph. This will keep increasing steadily until eventually it causes that aortic valve to kind of blow open. It's like if you had a dam that had too much water, it just all of a sudden shoots open. Once this happens, we have a steady drop in the ventricular volume. That's because the pressure has been built, and we also have a bit of a continued contraction. So we are just going to shoot blood from the ventricle into the aorta. That pressure is eventually, as you see, going to level out in a parabolic way. And that aortic valve is going to experience, or that aorta is going to experience a lot of pressure. This pressure is going to continue until it hits about a peak where we have ventricular repolarization. This is where the ventricle starts to relax. It's not pushing blood like it was. And so from that, we have the relaxation period. The pressure starts to decrease, the aortic valve closes, and then we have a stop in the loss of our ventricular volume. That's because that pressure is no longer great enough to keep that valve open, and we are no longer sending blood into the body. So that volume stops for a second. That pressure lowers and then becomes relatively constant for the aorta. And then we also have massive pressure decreases in the ventricle. Now, after the valve closes, we experience passive filling of the ventricle. This is because we're in that relaxation phase right here. Additionally, you'll notice really no pressure changes in the ventricle or in the aorta, or in the atria. That is because there's really no kind of excitation phase going on. The heart is in a complete relaxation phase, causing that passive filling that you see here. Then, at this dotted line, we see that the whole process kind of starts over again. So what does this tell us? Well, if we just had an EKG, that would tell us that the electrical impulses are working. But if we didn't have the rest of this, we wouldn't know that the heart is actually beating. That's because the reason we wouldn't know if the pressure changes were changing, if the volume was changing, or really any of that crucial information. So because of that, we wouldn't know if the heart was really contracting or if it was just receiving an impulse. So if you look at certain patients, maybe somebody who has atherosclerosis, this could change a lot. For example, atherosclerosis is basically the hardening of an artery because of plaque buildup. Kind of like with the heart, you'll have a decreased amount of space, but like you need that same volume to push through that space, so you can have increased blood pressure. Increased blood pressure will cause something called increased afterload, which basically makes opening that atrial valve or aortic valve a lot harder. If that pressure is higher, then this ventricular pressure will also need to increase in order to blow that open. So if you have a patient that's suffering through that, that can definitely cause issues. We're going to have a lot less blood being able to enter the aorta in the time that we have our contraction. This volume is not going to be as high. in terms of what's leaving the heart and entering the body. So how do we solve this? We could lower their blood pressure with the use of diuretics. This idea is basically getting rid of salts and waters in the body so that the blood pressure is decreased. When you do that, you will basically lower afterload, and this will allow for a lower threshold to blow open that aortic valve because you don't have that back pressure right here. So that is one example of a case study. We'll discuss another one here in a second, but this is basically Wigger's diagram. Again, it gives us a great overall picture of the heart and its function as a whole. They're not only showing us sound, but also showing us what's happening electrically and ensuring that we're receiving the right impulses to the heart, to specific regions at the right time. But it also shows us volume and pressure. These changes in volume and pressure ensure us that the heart is actually contracting and not just receiving a signal by showing us the changes in pressure, the changes in volume, and how these drops could affect each other. So for another case study, we have Bob. Bob is a 56-year-old who's come into our facility for a first appointment, and after looking at his medical charts, we see that he's got MI, which is myocardial infarction or heart attack. We've also got him listed as a bypass surgery, and we also see that he is on medication, specifically diuretic and a vasodilator. So before we jump into the case study, let's take a quick look at the cardiac output formula. So Q is going to equal cardiac output. HR is going to be heart rate. SV is our stroke volume. And basically anytime that SV increases while heart rate stays the same, heart rate increases while SV stays the same, or they both increase, we are going to have an increase in cardiac output. On the other hand, if heart rate decreases and stroke volume stays the same, stroke volume decreases and heart rate stays the same, or if they both decrease, then we'll have a decrease in cardiac output. Specifically for this case study, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into stroke volume. None of his symptoms seem like they will impact his heart rate directly. His heart rate will be impacted, but not by the heart attack or the meds that we see. So for stroke volume, we can affect that through our preload, our contractility, our afterload. Let's keep that in mind while we look at some of his symptoms and some of the medication he's on. So we know that he's had a heart attack. We know that he's had bypass surgery. We know that this must have been a pretty significant event, meaning that there was probably some kind of cell death in the heart. So because of the cell death, we're going to have a decrease in contractility. As we explained in Wigger's diagram and with some other things, that impulse may be delivered to the muscle cell, but if that muscle cell isn't awake to receive that impulse, then it's not going to contract. So from his heart attack and his bypass, if he's had cell death in that tissue, it will receive the impulse, it's not going to contract like we want it to. We're not going to have those pressure changes or that volume change that we saw in Wigger's diagram, and that contractility is going to take a dive. So if we wanted that cardiac output to stay the same with a decreased stroke volume, we're going to have to increase our heart rate. Bob is going to have to work a lot harder when he's in our facility. He's going to have to do more vigorous exercise, meaning that his exercise tolerance might be decreased. Because his heart rate can only reach a certain number before it's his max, we're not going to be able to do the same things that we used to do with him. Additionally, we know that Bob is on diuretics and he's on a vasodilator. This tells me that Bob has also struggled with some hypertension. So the diuretic could be used to decrease his overall volume. That medication, as I stated with atherosclerosis, it basically serves to decrease the water content and the salt content that's within the blood. This is done, hopefully, to decrease the overall volume and decrease that blood pressure. So this is just a theory, but that's what diuretics usually do. Now the reason that I'm saying that Bob more than likely has blood pressure issues is because of that vasodilator. When we exercise, diastolic blood pressure should stay about the same, and systolic will make a major jump. However, these values can become dangerously high in some patients, hence the use of a vasodilator. When we exercise, our blood gets basically pulled in the muscle. So let's say that I'm biking. That blood is going to pool in my quad, basically by major vasodilation in that area and vasoconstriction through the use of norepinephrine and epinephrine in places like my chest, my arms, my back, basically places where I don't need it. So during exercise or everyday life, if his blood pressure is becoming too high, then we might need to give him a vasodilator in order to dilate the rest of his body. So we don't want that pooling anymore. We want major vasodilation so that his overall blood pressure can drop. So the reason why his blood pressure becomes important is not only because of his ability to exercise effectively, but it's also going to really affect his afterload. So basically, as we stated with the aortic pressures previously with Wigger's diagram, this increased afterload is going to make it much harder for that aortic valve to shoot open as we build that pressure in the ventricle. When we do that, we have a decreased volume that can be ejected because that valve just simply isn't opening. And overall, we're going to have a decreased stroke volume. Again, as it was with the cell death that we saw, we're going to have decreased stroke volume, which means that if we wanted to maintain that cardiac output, we're going to have to boost heart rate, causing those differences in exercise tolerance that I just discussed. On the other hand, we could have decreased stroke volume with the same heart rate. If this is the case, then we're going to have a decreased cardiac output, again meaning that for Bob, his exercise tolerance is going to take a drastic dive. He won't be able to match the cardiac output that he could before the incident, and he's not going to be able to perform like he should. In summary, we talked about the anatomy of the heart, as well as how we can see that this anatomy is properly working through the EKG and the Wigger's diagram. We also looked at some case studies and how pharmacological agents can affect exercise tolerance, as well as certain pathologies.